Welcome to our final talk for SCP-105, Life in the Universe. We've had quite a journey. We started off by considering what life was in the first place, and then we looked at how life developed on Earth and what the different forms of life took on Earth. That led us to think about what forms of life might exist elsewhere, whether our ideas about life were too narrow. Maybe they could be expanded to other environments. We looked to the solar system to try to discover life there. Maybe we'll find some in our lifetimes, maybe not. And then we thought about places beyond the solar system that could have living things. We learned that there are many thousands of planets that have been discovered, and many billions and trillions more that are left to be discovered. We have thought about whether there might be any living things on those worlds, including living things that have the ability to communicate across interstellar distances, perhaps using radio technology, or perhaps in some other way. We've thought about humans' ability to travel throughout the solar system, and we've even thought about what it would be like to travel to other star systems, as difficult a technical feat that would be. But today we're going to think about some other ideas that are proposed not always in the realm of science, but sometimes in the media or in popular culture, amongst those that think that they have some insight into this question about whether there are life forms beyond our own world. Indeed, many people have ideas that there not only are such life forms, but that they have become intelligent, have developed technologies that far exceed our own, and are visiting us on a regular basis in what they deem to be spacecraft. Now, many of the people who are making these claims don't have the technical expertise in the wide range of fields necessary to evaluate whether this is a possibility or not. And while some of the people making these claims do have technical expertise in certain areas, perhaps they're a pilot or a law enforcement officer. Maybe they're a scientist or an engineer of one sort or another, or maybe they're just a person that is very interested in looking at the sky. That expertise doesn't necessarily translate into being a reliable accounting of whether there are pieces of evidence for extraterrestrial intelligence visiting us or making themselves known. As we discussed before, there isn't a lot of evidence, in fact, no solid evidence whatsoever, that extraterrestrial intelligence of the sort we've been looking for exists. People continue to look, but so far nothing has been found. And yet, if you turn on a television, you could probably find a program that is on right now claiming something else, claiming that in fact there is strong evidence, amazing evidence, and perhaps even covered up evidence that such things exist, that such amazing events are occurring and have occurred in human history, where contact between intelligence from other worlds has happened. Today, these often get summarized under one title, 3 letters, UFO. And across many different cultures and countries and societies, people share these stories thinking that they have very strong claims. But do they? That's what we're going to evaluate in our last discussion today. Whether these claims that are made, that there are contact events that have happened between humans and other beings, that are intelligent and not from this world are really as strong as the people who make the claims say they are. And so we'll begin. So I have entitled this discussion, UFOs, a critical examination. And I hope to be able to look carefully, but not biasedly, at many of the claims that have been made over the years regarding these stories. I can't possibly include every single claim that has ever been made. And while I'll try to focus on some that are famous, there probably will be some claims that I won't be able to discuss that are very famous as well. My hope is that by providing you some of the tools to evaluate these kinds of claims, you can, when you encounter them, look at them carefully and critically yourself and make your own determination about how strong or weak the evidence that is provided might be. This isn't an easy task. In fact, there are very intelligent people that sometimes fail, or at least in my judgment, haven't been very successful in applying some of these critical thinking techniques to claims that have been made. We won't talk about these people by name. I think that's a little too cruel. But you might be able to learn of some of them as we start to investigate this topic. And if you are interested in such topics, you might try to use some of the ideas that I'm presenting here to think for yourself and try to ask and answer your own questions. I'm going to start with a part of the history of these things called UFOs that often gets overlooked when the popular story begins to be told. By the way, the three letters UFO were proposed as an acronym to describe a phenomenon that people didn't really understand when it was first coming onto the scene. Now, some period of time ago, almost 70 years, in fact. The acronym was proposed to not say anything about what was causing the phenomenon or even whether it was real. The acronym goes unidentified flying object. And at its core, that's a very basic and perhaps broad statement about what someone might be seeing. If you can't identify something, how do you know that it's real? And the answer is you often do not. Now, there might be some techniques for trying to determine what is and isn't true about an observation, about some claim that someone has seen a UFO. But a lot of these ideas about evaluating people who have seen flying objects come out of a time in history, in particular in the United States of America, when concern over flying objects was at an all-time high. This was during the stages of World War II, where there weren't any battles being fought on the North American continent, but nevertheless was great concern that that might someday happen. All across the coasts of the United States and Canada, outlook towers like this were built with radio receivers and a station where somebody could go out onto a platform and scan the skies in some concern that there might be an enemy aircraft invasion of the United States coming either from the enemies in Europe or the enemies in Japan. This entire group of people and this culture of looking at the skies and seeing if you could identify the aircraft that were flying and reporting any that may have been suspicious to the authorities continued after the war ended. And people began to make note of flying objects that they thought were suspicious. All over the world, there are agencies as parts of governments which track the flight plans for large aircraft. And in order to fly a large aircraft, you need to file such a flight plan with the local agency, wherever you may be. In many cases, people would report seeing flying objects that weren't logged in the flight plans. And this is where the entire question of whether there might be unidentified flying objects in the skies began. And so there were some investigations that occurred to try to decide whether this was something that was worth investigation. But because a lot of these claims were being made by people who had different levels of observational skill, one might want to have a few checkpoints to make sure that the stories that are being told and the claims that are being made might be something that can be verified. This isn't always easy to do. We rely on other people to tell us information. And we hope that by reputation, many of these people are telling the truth. Sometimes that doesn't work. We also hope that there are rigorous ways of determining what is true and what isn't. Sometimes that doesn't work either. Where it gets confused is when someone makes a claim and someone else says that that claim is incorrect. When there's that sort of controversy, it becomes important to try to figure out who might be correct and who might be incorrect. How do you go about doing that? There was an astronomer by the name of Carl Sagan, who we've been discussing lately, who was very interested in the question of discovering life outside of the Earth. But he was also concerned about the proliferation of claims that he thought had no basis. People making amazing declarations about what they knew to be true or factual, which he thought were dubious or perhaps even intentionally misleading. And so he wrote a book called The Demon Haunted World that was meant to describe some of these problems that he was seeing in the popular culture and among people he was meeting, and to provide some tools that could be used to detect when a claim wasn't something that you perhaps should accept at face value, whether a claim might be in fact incorrect. And of course, this isn't always easy to do. If someone tells you that a certain object they saw is a particular length, and you can go get the object and your own ruler and measure it, then you can confirm whether they're telling the truth or not. But if someone says they saw an unidentified flying object on some occasion, and all you have to go on is their word, how is it that you can determine whether they're telling the truth or not? That's not always an easy thing to do. So Carl Sagan proposed that there were a few things that you could look for which might convince you that there was more evidence than could be available for a false claim, and then that might convince you the claim was true. Or on the other hand, he wanted you to look and see if there were some red flags, some indications that perhaps the story wasn't all it was made out to be. He called these techniques baloney detection, the idea of baloney being something that just wasn't true, or even worse than not being true, could sometimes be intentionally misleading. And he thought that everyone should have a baloney detection kit at hand to be able to decide when someone was being truthful in their claims and when someone was making something up or being intentionally misleading, or perhaps were misled themselves. And so here's a list of some of the things that Carl Sagan thought we should look at. The first item on the list is independent confirmation. This isn't always possible. Sometimes people make claims and only they had seen the thing and no one else. But let's say, for example, that someone says that they have seen something and there is another person who corroborates or says they also saw it. As you get more and more of this sort of independent confirmation, you can become more confident that the claim is true. Now, there are some things to consider here. Is the confirmation truly independent? Sometimes people use family members, close personal friends, or confidants, and they get together and say, well, here we have more than one person providing independent confirmation. And while that may very well be the case, that these observations were made independently and truthfully, there can also be situations where connections between observers may lead them both to be misled. And in some cases, they might be both trying to mislead. So independent confirmation is important, but it isn't necessarily the total sum of what is needed to decide whether something's truthful or not. It's just one indication of something you might look for if you're trying to decide if a claim is true. Another thing that you can ask when someone tells you something is true is whether they're open to discussing a series of possibilities, including the idea that maybe they're mistaken. This is the idea of substantive debate. One person thinks that a phenomenon exists, another person disagrees. Do both people accept that there could be a substantive debate over this subject? Or is one person saying it's not possible to do that? In general, the idea of encouraging substantive debate is an idea that needs to be done in a serious and also careful fashion. It is possible to set up debates that lead to one conclusion and obscure or completely reject others without people realizing that's what's going on. There are tricks and tools of what is called rhetoric that allow some people to claim to be open to debate, but when you look carefully, it turns out that they really are not. On the other hand, sometimes people use the idea that they are open to debate to try to trick people into thinking that an outrageous claim is one that's worthy of consideration. It's a slow and perhaps underhanded technique of trying to change people's minds through simply saying, well, we should just talk about this subject, when there really isn't anything more that they can do other than talk about it. Still, if someone is truly convinced that they are correct, they shouldn't shy away from some discussion about whether they might be incorrect. And if they do allow and encourage substantive debate, that's usually a pretty good indication that they are at least adhering to some of the rules that we might look for critical thinking. And that might give you some encouragement that what they are talking about might be true. But again, this is a list that you just go and check things off. You can't say definitively, even if something meets all the criteria, that it is a true claim. It's just evidence in favor or against a claim being true. Another thing that Carl Sagan requested that we do was avoid arguments from authority, which is to say that you shouldn't say that something is true just because an authority says it's true. Now, authorities can be useful, especially when their authority is gained legitimately. Someone who has studied a subject closely might be more qualified to talk about it than someone else. On the other hand, authorities can be wrong. And just because an authority says something is true doesn't mean it is. They should be able to back themselves up. It shouldn't just be on their word. And an argument from authority is exactly that. Sometimes arguments from authority are confusing because the authority that is quoted isn't necessarily an authority. For example, someone might say that a police officer has been known to see UFOs. And since they are a police officer, they must be true. Well, that doesn't necessarily follow. And their position as a police officer gives them no more credibility than any other person would in claiming this. So it is important to be careful whenever someone makes an argument from authority. You should back up your statements with evidence. And if that's possible, it almost doesn't matter whether the person talking is an authority or not. The next bullet point Carl Sagan asks you to consider is whether multiple hypotheses are considered about a particular thing that's claimed. We're going to see this happen a lot in our discussion today, where people who have believed they have seen unidentified flying objects that are evidence for extraterrestrial intelligence often don't consider simpler or alternative hypotheses that might also be true. They immediately jump to the idea that it has to be an extraterrestrial intelligence. Entertaining multiple hypotheses is very important, and not just a few, but a great variety of them. Sometimes this means that you can't come to a strong conclusion one way or another, and that's okay. In many cases, there are stories that are told where the evidence is so weak and thin, it's really kind of difficult to know what's going on. A person that is convinced that extraterrestrial intelligence is visiting us in flying objects will generally not want to consider those alternatives and instead insist that the only thing that you should consider is their idea. And that should be cause for concern. That brings us to the next bullet point, which is hypothesis attachment. Sometimes people go in to these debates and discussions believing with such certainty that their idea is correct that they can't let go or believe that they might be incorrect. Now, it is good to believe that you're correct. It helps you build a stronger argument. But if you're overly attached to your hypothesis, you can end up falling victim to the problem of accepting very shaky evidence in favor of your hypothesis and rejecting strong evidence that your hypothesis is wrong. This is a big problem. When people are overly attached to one particular hypothesis, they tend to reject others and may end up missing the true answer to the question. One more thing that you can often ask for and look for when someone's making a claim is the numbers and measurements, the quantities that they might have related to that claim. If someone says they saw a big thing, how big was it and how did they measure its size? If it was bright, how bright was it? And how did they compare its brightness? If they could figure out how far away it was, in what manner did they do that? And what were the actual quantities that they measured? Knowing what the actual quantities were and are allows you to give a context for the story and be able to make some simple calculations to see if what they're saying is plausible. But in many cases, numbers aren't provided at all, or sometimes when they are, they change dramatically from one story to the next. And that could be cause for concern. In order to have a reliable understanding of what the quantities are, they should be reproduced over and over again. Sometimes that's not possible. But if you can do that, well, that's a strong indication that at least there's something that has been measured and something that's interesting. The next point that Carl Sagan asks us to consider is that there's sometimes a chain of reasoning that goes on, where people try to build up an argument in favor of a hypothesis. And they might make a simple statement like they saw a light, and then start to explain more and more and more about the light until they reach a final conclusion that extraterrestrial intelligence has visited us here on Earth. It's important to follow each of those links in that chain to see if they're all very strong claims or whether any of them are weak. And if there are weak claims in that chain of reasoning, it's important to understand that no matter how strong the other chains are, that weak link is the strength of the entire claim. Finding those weak links are important things to do, even if you are trying to show that you're correct. You should look for your own weak links and try to strengthen them if possible. And if it turns out they're so weak that the entire chain of reasoning falls apart, that might be something to accept as well. The second to last idea that Carl Sagan asks us to consider is something that's popularly called Occam's razor. It's named after a philosopher, Willem of Ockham, who made a comment in one of his long writings that often the most parsimonious, which is a long word for simple and straightforward explanation, is often the correct one. Sometimes we say this as the simpler, the better. When someone is trying to make a claim, and there are two competing ideas for how that claim might be correct, if one of those ideas is simpler than the other, Occam's razor asks you to consider the simpler idea to be much more likely to be correct. Let's imagine that someone sees a light in the sky. They say that that light might be extraterrestrial intelligence, a vehicle visiting us from another planet, from thousands of light years away. There's a lot of questions that that claim brings up. How does the vehicle get here? Where did it come from? What mechanism of space travel does it use? How do you know it's a vehicle at all? There's lots of questions that are asked by this. Someone else makes a claim that, in fact, what that person saw was a lamp post and a lit lamp in that lamp post, and shows that that was the direction that they were looking at. Well, we all know that lampposts exist and that they're bright and that they're lit at night. It seems a rather simple explanation, but you have two competing claims. Which one is likely to be correct? Well, you do need to do a little bit more investigating, likely, but if you have reason to believe both people are being as truthful as they can, a simpler explanation is often going to be the one that's correct. That's not always the case, but the idea here is that if you were, for example, to gamble on one idea or the other, you'll often win if you gamble on the simpler answer. The final thing to look at that Carl Sagan mentioned, and realize that there are other things that could be added to this list as well, is the question of falsifiability. Now, students, when they first hear this word, sometimes confuse it for the idea that something might be incorrect or untrue, false. But falsifiability doesn't mean that an idea is false. What falsifiability means is that an idea can be shown to be false. In other words, I'm making some statement and I'm providing a way for you to check it out. And if you find when you check it out that something doesn't match up, then the statement I make is shown to be wrong. This is a feature that certain ideas have that others do not. If someone says, I saw a light last night and it showed in the sky briefly and then disappeared and no one else saw it, you can't go and check to see whether that's true. It happened last night, according to the claim. There's no indication or expectation that it will happen again. The claim is fundamentally unfalsifiable. There's no way for me to show whether it's correct or not. And crucially, there's no way for me to show that it isn't correct. That doesn't mean the claim is wrong. It just means that it's unfalsifiable, which is an unfortunate feature that claim has if what you're trying to do is verify whether it's correct or not. If instead somebody says, every night at the same time, 10 p.m., I look in this direction and I always see this light. That is something that can be falsified. Tonight, in principle, you could go out at 10 p.m., look in that direction and see if they're correct, if that light is there. If it's not there, they're falsified. But if it is there, that's further evidence in favor of their claim. So in order for a claim to be falsifiable, there has to be some way of going out to check whether it's correct or not, or crucially, check to see whether it's incorrect. And if there is a way to test that it's incorrect, we say that that type of claim is falsifiable. And that's a good thing for a claim to have. Because if you can have the ability to show that something is incorrect, this means that you can go out and test it and see and verify whether or not this is happening in the way that it was described. Many times people will make claims that fail falsifiability, and there's not much that can be done about such situations. As I said, that doesn't necessarily mean the claims that are made are incorrect. It just means we have fewer ways of evaluating and knowing whether what the claim is saying is actually true. So let's start to turn these tools on the question of whether UFOs could possibly be extraterrestrial intelligence, vehicles visiting us from other planets. This is one of the first reports that was ever done on this question. It was filed in 1955 by the Air Force of the United States. This is also in part of this work where the term unidentified flying objects was first used, although you can see here they used the term unidentified aerial object here. The conclusions of this report, and indeed the conclusions of many reports that have followed, have been that there are many false alarms, many claims of UFOs that don't seem to have strong evidence that there's anything unusual going on at all. And for the few claims that can't be explained, they're not of the quality that would be required for us to say anything substantial or clear about what the claim actually is saying. In some cases, the claim is unfalsifiable. In others, it's a claim of a number of people that may not be corroborated in one way or another. The very fact that there were so many claims being made and so many of them turned out to be incorrect led the people studying this issue to conclude that it probably wasn't worth further investigation. And in spite of decades of people trying to get more investigations done, this seems to be the conclusion over and over again. Just recently, a new round of questions arose over some videos that were taken by some pilots from the US Navy. And the question was whether they had seen some bizarre extraterrestrial intelligent aircraft or spacecraft flying around. And the same arguments ended up happening over and over again. The evidence that was presented was not as strong as one would have liked, perhaps, in order to make a very bold claim such as that. The alternative hypotheses are suggested and thought about and difficult to dismiss. And ultimately, it doesn't seem to be worth the amount of time and effort that people would like to spend that are interested in the hypothesis that there are extraterrestrial intelligent beings visiting us. It is the attachment to this idea which keeps propelling these claims over and over again, and becoming detached from that hypothesis often leads people to conclude that they're not worth investigating. And that can be very frustrating for people who are what we would say true believers. But nevertheless, that was one of the reports that resulted in this, and there have been subsequent ones that have done the same. And it's perhaps good for us to think about what some of the claims of UFOs that have been identified ended up being. I call these identified flying objects IFOs, and I think it's important for us to compare the IFOs to the UFOs, and in particular, look at what some of the things that have been mistaken for unidentified flying objects ended up being identified as. I have 4 different kinds of IFOs for us to consider. There's natural phenomena, things that we know exist in nature, either here on Earth, in some cases they're astronomical. There are human technologies that exist, which can be mistaken for something that's unidentified. And then there are the cases of hoaxes, where people are hoping that someone might misidentify something that they're doing as evidence for an extraterrestrial intelligence. And finally, there are the delusions. These are, importantly, not just people that have issues with cognitive ability or hallucinating, although that does happen sometimes. In many cases, delusions are things that can happen to well-meaning people, and we'll discuss some of those instances as well. One of the first claims of UFOs was made by this fellow. He was a pilot in Washington State who was flying his plane around and thought that he saw some unidentified flying objects, flying information. His name was Kenneth Arnold, and his report made the local news in the newspapers at the time in 1947. And he was even tasked with creating some artwork that showed what he thought he had seen. You can see him pointing out this design that he had seen, or he had claimed to see as a pilot. Now, it was just he who had seen these. There was no other evidence other than his own recounting. As a pilot, he made some judgment about how fast these flying objects were moving, quite fast and quite far away from his aircraft, and what shapes they looked like. Now, there's really no way to know what he saw, because it was only Kenneth Arnold who saw them and made the report. Nevertheless, you might look at this object and think, that looks like some other things that have been seen flying in the sky. And it has been pointed out that there are some flying objects that are relatively nearby where Kenneth Arnold was flying that might have this sort of shape, and this is one of them. These are pelicans. Now, Kenneth Arnold certainly had seen pelicans. Is it the case that he mistook pelicans for unidentified flying objects? And incidentally, he described them as skipping across the surface of the sky like saucers. And that's perhaps where the term flying saucer came from. We can't be certain, but one thing that we can do, because he provided us with some quantities of how fast and how far away he thought these objects were, is look at something called the parallax effect, where an object that you think is very far away and moving quickly could be, in fact, an object that's much closer and smaller and moving slowly, or at least slower than the object that you expected was moving very quickly when it was far away and larger. You can make some rough calculations to show that if instead of seeing a distant formation of flying aircraft, spacecraft, what have you, he was instead seeing a flock of pelicans, then in fact, the speeds he was reporting match up to the sizes of these birds. Now, is this what he saw? It's impossible to know. All we have are the evidence and the alternative hypotheses. You might have to go down the list of the bullet points from Carl Sagan's baloney detector kit. And unfortunately, sometimes we can't make it, but it is an interesting thing to note that people have claimed unidentified flying objects, which turned out to be some of these large birds. Pelicans indeed are quite large. Some of them are the size of small humans. Another report that people sometimes make of UFOs are surprisingly clouds. Now, most people say they've seen clouds and wouldn't mistake one for a UFO. But if you saw a cloud like this in the sky and you weren't prepared for it, you might mistake it for an aircraft of some sort. In fact, it bears a striking resemblance to a lot of drawings people make of flying saucers. And UFOs. These are called lenticular clouds. They appear in very peculiar weather environments. When they do appear, they often appear in the evening and can be lit up in bright colors, the reds and golds of the sunset. That might be one of the indications of a bizarre phenomenon that someone is seeing that they report as a UFO. And if someone thinks that they must have evidence for extraterrestrial spacecraft, seeing something like this could be amazing. Here's another case of a UFO. This one was caught on a webcam. And here we have a bright streak across the sky. You might realize that the streak is far brighter than anything else you'd seen that night, maybe even brighter than the moon, it seems. But ever so briefly, and then it disappears. What could it possibly be? Well, this turns out to be a meteor. A meteor is a bit of rock or sand or dust that enters the Earth's atmosphere. And if it's large enough and moving at its considerable speed, it will burn up in the Earth's atmosphere. And in some cases can cause a loud explosion that can be heard. And even smoke trails can pass from it. In this particular case, this was a meteor that crashed in over the Asian continent and actually smashed windows in Russia. It was a very dramatic event in 2015. Meteors and their associated fireballs that occur, called bolides, are often mistaken for spacecraft visiting from other planets. But in fact, they are very much close to the Earth. They are the space debris that's from our own solar system burning up in our atmosphere. This is another instance of a particularly famous example of an IFO. People report this particularly bright object. They can sometimes be embarrassed when they find out that rather than a flying object, this happens to be the planet Venus. Venus is incredibly bright. It's the third brightest star in the sky. And it is unmistakable to the human eye as something different than a star because it actually doesn't take up a point, but can be made out to be kind of a surface, which it is. If you train your binoculars or small telescope on Venus, you'll actually see that it goes through phases like our moon. This bright spot in the sky is also seen very close to the horizon, either at sunrise or sunset. And at those times, it can change colors if it's close to the horizon in the same way that the sun changes colors when it sets. And so you might see some red coloring that is associated with this object. And it's also moving through the sky as the entire sky is moving around us as the Earth turns. Venus will, in the evening, for example, appear to set a few hours after the sunset. You might hear stories of people chasing a UFO, thinking that it's going to land. And it turns out to be Venus that's setting in the western sky. And as fast as you chase that, you're never going to catch that particular UFO. Here's an example of a claim that was made about 50 years ago. Not only was there a crash of a spacecraft claimed in this case, and it seems that there was perhaps a meteor shower seen at that time. When someone went out into the forest to investigate, they saw what they said was a strange being, alien-like. And they made this picture of it to illustrate what they saw. Well, could this possibly be a visitor from another planet? Interesting idea. What we should consider, however, is alternative hypotheses. And we actually do know of some living things in that forest that have some striking similarities to this. And here's an example of what that might look like. On the left, you'll see a mock-up of the drawing of this peculiar being. And on the right, you'll see a match to what an owl of about the same half height of that being might look like if it was on a tree branch. Could this be what they saw? Owls are particularly strange looking things. And when you take a look at an owl, you might see some interesting features that resemble perhaps some strange looking living beings, extraterrestrial in nature. unclear. We'll then consider another very famous story associated with UFOs, and this is the story of Area 51 and the crash at Roswell, New Mexico. Area 51 is a part of a military base in southern Nevada, and how it got connected to a town in New Mexico is a long story, but we'll start with the story from the town in New Mexico. This was a story in the local newspaper where a farmer thought they saw an alien spacecraft crash into their farm yard. And when they went to investigate, they actually found debris and said this was spacecraft debris. Now, it's not very clear from these pictures, which were published in the local paper, what they're looking at here, but it turns out that they're looking at a substance that makes up a balloon. This was a special sort of surveillance balloon that was made by the military to test out perhaps spying technology. And so there was some top secret aspect to this. The officials collected the material and took it back to a military base to investigate the crash. The report is published. We know that this was a military surveillance balloon that crashed, but still people thought that perhaps there was something else going on. It became even more sensationalized about 30 years ago in the 1990s, when two enterprising people claimed to have a videotape this amount of news, and people went berserk talking about this story. It was actually broadcast television, and people got very excited by this. It was only later realized and actually admitted to by the people who made the film that the autopsy was not one that was actually footage of any event, but was actually a recreation of an event that they claimed to have seen. It gets a little bit worse from there. The people who are making the claims may have had ulterior motives, financial in nature, for making them. You could make a lot of money selling VHS copies of this alien autopsy video, for example. Whether they're on the up and up or not, I won't get into. But all of these stories got connected together and excite people as kind of a legend of sorts, all based on something that we actually knew happened, a balloon crashing in Roswell, New Mexico. Now, that story of a balloon crashing means that sometimes people actually continue to see balloons and mistake them for alien spacecraft. And here's an example of such a type of balloon. You can see this is a scientific balloon, pretty large, being filled. And as these balloons launch, they actually grow quite a bit in size as they get higher and higher in the atmosphere. And in the evening, up and reflect the light of the sun, definitely making people take two looks to see if they really understand what's going on. Balloons move in strange fashion. They don't move the same way as aircraft do. Often when these launches happen, people will report seeing UFOs in the sky. Other types of aircraft are mistaken for UFOs, including secret aircraft that are being developed by governments around the world. And sometimes these aircraft are not confirmed as being flying, and that can make people think that they have some real evidence there. This is an example of a stealth fighter. If you didn't know any better, and you didn't know such things existed, you might mistake this for some alien technology, when in fact it's very human. This is a picture of the U-2 jet in the Nevada test site, which is very close to where Area 51 is. The US military actually used some of these rumors to cover up some of the work that they were doing. The more people thought that what was going on was looking for alien technology, the less they might wonder about some of the actual human technology. This is another interesting UFO. You can see the date that was taken of this one. It looks like a string of UFOs flying information across the sky, seen in 2019. Well, this isn't a UFO at all. These are actually a string of satellites that were launched by SpaceX called Starlink. And unfortunately, it looks like we may be seeing a lot more of these, as there are plans by a number of companies to launch a tremendous number of these satellites into the sky. So if you hadn't seen a satellite yet, it is possible that in the future you'll see a lot of them flying around in the night sky. When rockets are launched from the Earth, sometimes they do things that are a little bit confusing to people that aren't used to them. This is a rocket launch that was seen in California. And you can see it looks very otherworldly. Some people have described these things as space jellyfish. But in fact, it's just rocket exhaust as we follow the trail of the rocket from the Earth to space. When rockets launch in a way that is bold, when there's a failed launch, they can sometimes spiral like a Roman candle or some sort of firework, and they produce dramatic sights in the sky. This one was seen over Norway in 2009. Of weird spiral anomalies can sometimes look like portals opening up to other worlds, but in fact, it's just a failed rocket launch that was made from Russia. And finally, with the proliferation of drone technology, make remarkable things with very simple in the media, and then I have briefly lost my connection here, so for that I apologize. Let me continue to share my screen. I have only a few more slides left after this hoax. Here's one of the more famous photographs that were taken of UFOs. This was one of the first ones taken in 1950 in McMinnville, Oregon. And unfortunately, we have reason to believe this was a hoax. Some enterprising people have looked carefully at this photograph and seen what appears to be a device to hang a dinner plate by a fishing line from the telephone wires that are up above at the top of this photograph. Now, the people taking the photograph claimed that that wasn't the case, but nevertheless, this was something that others had thought maybe this is the hoax that was done. Here's one of the more famous hoaxes of crop circles that were found in England in the 1990s. It was actually done by two people with very simple technology, and amazed people that they could actually do this. Are done as a matter of artwork, and you can actually see one as the Arecibo response to some artwork that was done as a response to the Arecibo message. And finally, we need to discuss eyewitness accounts are often used extraterrestrial intelligence. Those are diluted. When someone says something is true amongst a group, enough people agree, they can for it. It's been done. For me, if I claim enough times that something is true, even though you know it to be false, you can end up believing it's true in any case. One example of something that most people consider to be a sad case of delusion is the story of Barney, who were known as the first abductees by alien spacecraft in New Hampshire. In the 1960s, of them driving home, and they were chasing down what they thought was a UFO. At the time, they just reported that they came home, which they realized that which is when somebody puts you under a hypnotic trance and asks you questions. They decided that what had actually happened was that they were abducted by aliens. Now, since then, we've come to understand that when we go under a hypnotic trance, you become very suggestible. Are true in that, which actually are not. So this would not be considered today to be a reliable way of coming up with evidence. But at the time, it was all the rage and people were convinced that they had been telling the truth. Now, unfortunately, Barney Hill went on to die very soon thereafter, and Betty Hill continued to claim that she had lots of information from these alien beings, and included many of these stories that seem to be part of our own understanding of alien beings up to this day. She famously described them as being short and gray colored with large almond black eyes. And this is a picture that a lot of you had drawn when we asked you to draw what you thought about extraterrestrial intelligence. This story has entered the popular myth, but it seems pretty clear that if you were to read these archives carefully, that Betty Hill was a victim of delusional thinking, that she thought that she had had interactions that clearly couldn't have occurred. This is unfortunately often the case in many of these stories of abductions, and people have commented on how much abductions by aliens map closely to stories of abuse and really unfortunate events that might occur in people's lives that are easier to explain by these fantastical notions than by some of the more disturbing things that may happen. I finally want to talk about one last story that people sometimes claim, which is that in the past, there must have been visits by these extraterrestrial intelligences in order to explain things like the pyramids or the great wonders of the ancient world. This is a particularly problematic story because we actually know how the pyramids were built. There isn't the same level of mystery associated with them as there is with other things that we don't have answers for, including some of the mysteries we've been talking about in our class. In fact, we have extensive documentation, and the Egyptians were very careful at explaining how exactly they built these pyramids. It's pretty amazing how much we know about this. So why does the story keep getting promulgated that we have no way of knowing how these ancient buildings were created? It goes back to some people who were skeptical that humanity had that knowledge at all. And in particular, these tended to be people that had ulterior motives, some of them racist in thought and practice. These white men thought that it was impossible for other people to be smart. And there was no way that the Egyptians, who were not white, could have built the pyramids or any of these other amazing structures in ancient archaeological sites that we see around the world. That idea has promulgated through the media and continues to be promoted. Most people who are making those claims don't even realize necessarily where they have come from, but that is in fact where they're coming from. a very particular set of stories written by people who had this kind of biased and prejudiced view of the world. And that's always an important lesson for us. We should look carefully at what the motivations of people are when they tell these stories, and why they might be saying these things. Are they really after the truth, or are they trying to do something else? Sometimes they may not even be aware of their own motivations. This is what we might describe as a delusion. And it's important for us to keep in mind whenever we're investigating these things. So we'll continue to investigate and look, use the tools that we have, and hopefully discover new ideas. But we should also be careful, because we can easily be misled, as so many other people have been. I hope you can continue to have your baloney detection kit work, that you'll use it, and that we might be able to discover that we understand a little bit more about the universe after you're completed. Thanks very much. I hope you had a wonderful time, and we will see you later.